I will start recording. And once again, thanks everyone for joining. This is the sixth session of the Graviton training. If you have come to all of our sessions and claimed all your POAPs after this session, that means you will be able to become a Graviton after the training, and yeah, continue contributing to this project and practicing all what we are training and developing. So thanks everyone. And in this session we have once again Durgadas, and this session will go about decolonization of the mind. So yeah, I will pass the mic to him.
Thanks. Yeah. So welcome to number 6. There's a fair bit to cover here, and I could talk about this for literally 3 hours or 4 hours or 5 hours. So I'm going to just get started. Part of the reason I think we were talking about presenting Kinefin as kind of a...
Wish me luck. Good luck. Everything will be all right.
Sorry.
Please.
Yeah, it'll be okay.
I think
please
their
mute.
mics open. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so in any case, so I'm going to basically start with Kinefin, and then we'll get into decolonization in a bit. This does relate in some way to my decolonization framework, because my basic premise is that there are only 2 ways to think, and those are unified and divided. And I think that if you start thinking in divided ways, then you're kind of staying in this sort of gray area right here between the clear and the complicated. I love this graphic because it's very entertaining, but it's also kind of explains the typical way in which our colonized culture sort of almost demands things to be. There's really only 3 places for people. There's automation, there's the known and familiar. Anybody who doesn't fit into the known and familiar, we kick off into this other thing, which is one of the sort of byproducts of, for example, centralized monetary systems. And then we rely on experts and to basically know everything and to go up this ladder and bring us, some kind of clear, known, and familiar stuff. And so we almost have a demand level like in NVC where, we can't hear no to that. We can't really hear much about complexity or chaos. And the people who have been in the lab coats and done the complexity are expected to create some constraints for us so that experts can understand and that we can continue perpetuating this bifurcated system. So I just wanted to show you this to start with, but it's a very beautiful sense-making framework in the sense where you can make good decisions in terms of what it is that's going on. And there are 6 basic things in here, 4 central quadrants, and then the people who are getting kicked off the familiar cliff into the chaotic, and the people who are confused. So we'll review this again at the end of the actual presentation. So what I basically have done is created this framework, which I'm going to be writing a book about, actually, saying from a positionality standpoint that being a white guy, I'm the problem. So growing up in a family where I basically was dealing with a dad who was basically a CEO or a C-level person. He was raised and educated in a culture that divided things in half. And so a lot of the positionality that I come from is also I have a sort of a hidden disability in the sense that I have autism. And so a lot of times, it's what I'm basically saying is that people will often listen to what I'm saying in terms of my positionality as a white guy, but I've also get to witness, Wankas living in a country that's, perpetually dealing with, war. My wife, who's got 2 degrees, a gold medal in the Commonwealth Games, a silver medal in the Pan Am Games, and a bronze medal in the Olympic Games, does not prevent her from dealing with racism and sexism in an incredible way. So what I was, and I work for a native band, so what I was trying to do is find a way that I could understand and unify how all these different things worked. And I lived in a Hindu monastery for a number of years, and having done that spiritual work, I realized that there are really just 2 ways to think. There are unified and divided ways to think. I'm going to recommend strongly, as you saw in the pre-work, that you guys watch My Stroke of Insight by Jill Bolte Taylor, which talks about the 2 different kinds of ways of thinking, and then Ian McGilchrist's work on the divided brain and the making of the Western world is a very scholarly look at what I'm basically presenting you today. And what I'm essentially doing here is talking about how we have these 2 different approaches, and I do think that this has a huge effect on the token engineering side of the picture for ourselves personally. Has huge societal implications. It has implications in understanding how history works, and the real history, not the history that you typically learn about in school. And you can see this stuff playing out even, today. So in Canada, for example, we have the last old growth rainforest getting cut down, and we've got a group of people who are thinking in unified ways, who are trying to stop the divided colonizers from doing that. And my wife is heavily involved in that stuff, and they're just doing the same stuff that they've been doing for 500 years in that way. So my thought was to try to unify all these things in terms of how is it that we got banking that was so centralized? Why is it that we need things to be done differently? So my proposal basically is that you have 2 hemispheres: your left brain, which is the divided way of thinking, and the right hemisphere, which is the unified way of thinking. This also goes back to yoga in terms of Ha and Ta. Ha means sun, Ta means moon. If you look at the social forms that we actually set up, you can actually see that in what we ratify in terms of the divided mind, we teach really only divided things in our culture, right? And one of the beautiful things about being in the Token Engineering Commons is you actually get to deal with a cultural context in which we're trying to get more to the highly unified side of this picture. So it used to be that you could have somebody like Genghis Khan or somebody came up with a very divided worldview, but that person would be reabsorbed into the highly unified approach that was had by most people in the world. But since colonization has occurred, that emphasis has switched now, where you've got now colonizer worldviews dominating, and unified worldviews are basically given back to pre-colonization, and or they're put into the psychological shadow, where we deny that there is any such thing as a unified way of approaching anything. And so so a lot of people actually who show up in the Token Engineering Commons and in my yoga center, and when I'm speaking to Wanka and people like this, it's always the whole thing is always about taking a look at which one of these 2 things are we doing in terms of that. So you can see that the divided mindset will create hierarchies by default, and we're systematically destroying hierarchies and specifically decentralizing in ways that flatten hierarchies, right? Using holarchies and so on. So I hope this is pretty clear. So there's the 2 monetary systems as well. So if you read, the Sacred Economics by Eisenstein, You can see inside of the stuff that he's talking about. You can see this also inside of the stuff that Griff is saying all the time. The money system is broken. What's broken about it is that we've been validating and ratifying this divided mindset all along, right? And you can just see it over and over and over again. You can see it individually in your own life. You can see it in your family life. You can see it in your the way you're educated. I mean, just our entire culture is basically set up as an abusive system. And so, the next thing really is just that it actually changes the way we approach things intellectually as well. So we have an educational system that's focused on external objects, which are given positive value by the society, and it basically ignores the student altogether. Like Marshall Rosenberg, the guy who sort of created the NVC framework, he said he went through 12 years of post-secondary education and a regular education. He never really was asked how he felt about any of that during any of that time, and that's normal, and that's been normalized. And it's my basic idea that to say that we actually. I apologize. There's one thing that I normally say in here, but I've been redoing this, so I'm sorry if it's a little bit lost here. Just the way we socialize, even, take a look at the things that are legal in our culture. So if we all want to go, we all go out and have a drink, but alcohol is destructive and addictive, and there are so many things like that in a socialization system where all the things that you're told that you're supposed to have a good time about, these things are actually destructive. But anything that's illegal tends to be something that would sort of break the divided hold on the system. And so I think this is a useful contextualization in terms of trying to understand how this stuff works. It's also true that I took a course from Neil Dalal. It was really good. And he basically is saying, what is the definition of colonization? And it's basically the shadow side or the dark side of Western modernity, right? The other half of Western progress. I grew up in the United States, and there was this whole idea of the manifest destiny, which was this idea that we were supposed to sort of work our way across, the country, from east to west. But, we basically didn't care at all, and we didn't ever learn anything about it in school, about the domination and subjugation of other people as we went along. And there's this idea of, I think what most people think of as colonialism is actually the transfer of people. So we just moved people into places where people already were, and there's things called settler colonialism. But there's quite a lot more to it than it might appear on the surface. And so I'd like to talk to you basically about this psychology, which is behind all of these things, not just, the sort of results of it. Because it's also true that I think that we are all trapped in this system. So there's an awful lot of emphasis on sort of things like, mansplaining and manspreading. And so there's a lot of things going on about the white male. But the fact is that the abuse that the white male is undergoing, they're also in denial of, right? So the main thing that's visited upon the white male person is sort of a denial of the fact that they're privileged in certain ways. But the fact is that if you're oppressed in 1,000 different ways, and someone says to you that you can be free of, let's say, 50 of those things, then you're going to tend to deny the other 950 so that you can reap the benefits of those 50. And then you're often not open to the fact that other people might be experiencing the full 1,000 if you're in denial of so much of what's going on. My basic assertion here is that colonization is a worldwide financial and governance level expression of narcissistic abuse. And I think all abuse is narcissistic in terms of, and it has multiple implications, which we've seen an awful lot of in the Western media with rise of Trump and other authoritarian figures in this fairly dystopian period of time we're all living in, they all have very similar things, right? So what's kind of neat, if you look across all of these things, you can actually see that people who are trying to recover from narcissistic abuse, like how I grew up as a child with my father, the way he was, and people who are in abusive partnerships, people who are in cults or in education facilities. Like, I don't know if you ever heard the song "Institutionalized." Basically gives you a nice overview of that problem. And so, and then if you look at the way social justice movements are set up, or even Bitcoin, the perpetual disaster that is Bitcoin, it's just always going to be wrong, because it is a kind of social justice movement. It's a decentralization, and of course, all the centralized media and everyone else is going to see this as some kind of a threat. So imagine a person who's decided that they were going to be a vegan. Now that person is suddenly a violent person, when in fact their choice of being a vegan was done so on compassionate grounds. So everything is sort of turned upside down. And what I wanted to do is just have a nice examination of the root cause of all of these different things. What is it that's individually happening in the individual psychology? And then those people who are sort of in that system of abuse are going to then tend to project that outward. So you can see that social justice movements, environmentalist movements, animal rights movements, all of these things are all considered to be not compassionate movements, which is what they actually are, but rather by the centralized system that's the divided mindset that's taking place there. The divided mindset can't really know anything about the unified mindset, because that unified mindset has been placed into the psychological shadow. And so all of the participants, when they look for validation on their unified impulses, they're going to tend to not find them. In fact, they're going to find things that make them scared of that. And so, in any case, the other thing that it's done is it's actually broken our information ecology, thinking about things in these colonized or divided ways, right? And so if you actually take a look at the real history of the world, even things like intellectualism and American life, get to this. This two-factor way of thinking, the unified and divided, and that the divided created colonization, explains the real history of the world on so many levels. And so I wanted to go into this. It's also important to understand that colonization is broken up into some pieces in terms of colonization is basically the construction of these systems. So, for example, my participation in the Token Engineering Commons and Gravity and the comms groups are all basically because we are literally constructing systems which, if we're not careful, could be colonizing systems, right? And then later on, 50, 100 years later, 150 years later, you can see that coloniality is something which then perpetuates that type of divided thinking in service of those colonized systems. So when I'm talking to token engineers, when I'm talking to people about yoga, I'm talking to people about these things, I'd like people to sort of understand how these different things work. And there are very important epistemic and ontological differences between, pre-colonized worldviews and colonized worldviews and sort of post-colonized or sort of freedom-oriented worldviews, like I believe we're constructing here in the Token Engineering Commons. So, yeah, sorry, this is mislabeled, but if you ignore this type of thing here at the beginning, you can see that oppression is kind of where it starts. This is set up in terms of yoga. When we're talking about yoga, people often think about things in terms of Orientalism, which is basically a way to sort of do yoga without including anybody from the cultures that created it, right? And so if you start with oppression and then move into colonization, and then sort of other people in this idea of the Orient, you can sort of then culturally appropriate yoga without ever having to include those people. And you can see that this is a thing which happens systematically everywhere. And so this is kind of the process of division that we experience in these colonized systems. So, talking about oppression, it arises from power plus prejudice, right? So, it actually, when you construct these systems, you tend to construct them in a systemic fashion. And you can see that we're actually doing exactly the opposite here in terms of each one of these individual bullet points to the possibility that it could be something else entirely that we can do. So we're basically doing the reverse of all of these things. So then when we're decolonizing, we basically have to recenter our epistemologies and our voices and systems, and that's a thing I think we're very much doing here. Disrupting and delinking from the systemic Western Eurocentric epistemologies, and remembering and understanding the histories of those colonized people and colonialism and coloniality, racism, sexism, transphobia, fear of people on the autism spectrum like myself, and that sort of thing. Divesting from colonial practices and products. This is extremely important. And repatriating. I work for a native band. We have 2 full-time people who work in the native band who literally just scour the websites of museums throughout the world trying to get back their artifacts, their tangible artifacts from museums around the world that have been taken out of Vancouver Island. So undoing extraction and exclusion, that's an incredibly important aspect. And undoing the asymmetrical power dynamic is super important because one of the things that the divided does is it sets up asymmetric systems. So you can see, for example, the current Facebook setup is you've got all these people who are over there basically hacking your amygdala. And that's a hugely asymmetric practice. So at a certain point, we banned things like subliminal advertising for a reason, but Facebook actually does a better job at that by hacking your whole reward system in your brain. And then to magnify voices who have something to teach us that have been suppressed or silenced or pushed into the psychological shadow of the whole society as a whole. And then to do reframing is also important for us individually, and to then have the courage to go into social situations to reframe as well. This is just an example in terms of Orientalism, but you could make many of these same arguments in terms of the financial system, the poor, different things. I actually have another graphic, which I think I'm going to include in here eventually, and I'll show it to you guys, that actually talks about how people deal with this thing. It's called Flick. It's actually a process for making people not be able to tell what real science is, right? So for example, if you take a look at the Flick systems, there's this sort of fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. So, and they actually go into some detail about how all of this this works in terms of how do different conspiracy theories and things happen. This is all, when I say it's narcissistic abuse, is because these are various forms of gaslighting and things that you see in narcissistic abuse systems. So in terms of Orientalism, there's these ontological and epistemological distinctions made between whatever the target or the pretext of the abuse is. Like, we're going to go into yoga, so we're going to sort of extrapolate the Orient out of this and the Occident and create a false binary out of that. And we do all the same things in almost every situation. So, race, sex, money, everything. So, instead of thinking about giving money to people as a compassionate thing, we create these false binaries that there's some welfare queen, which is existing, driving around in a sports car, just being on welfare. So there's just a whole lot of things that line up in this same exact way. There's also this idea of the good Orient existed long ago, in the same way that, this whole, make things great like they used to be, but they really weren't that great back then. And the bottom one is what I said before: Westerners needing to protect against an Indian past of yoga, like in this case, without requiring any modern day actual Asians to exist there. So you can see this again and again, like on Reddit threads and things about Bitcoin and other things. The subtitle of this is called Post-Truth, Post-Race, Post-Colonization, and I put that as a subtitle because it's a bit of a test, really, because those things don't really exist. Post-truth is not a real thing. Post-race is not relevant at all. Post-colonization is still occurring, and so one of the crucial things to know is that there's this idea of that I got from Tim Wise that he relates to specifically his work on anti-racism, that actually talks about the pathology of privilege, which is that that there's a kind of blindness that existed, right? There's, for example, was a blindness that existed among the parents of the teenagers who did the Columbine massacres, right? Because they were white people and they were living in a largely white sort of situation. They didn't really, they had a kind of privilege that made it so that they didn't have to know that there was this sort of dark shadow thing going on. And that is a pathology. And so that's why earlier I said that it's a kind of blindness. And it's my sort of basic idea that I want to help people sort of understand that this exists and then become aware of it and then help them get beyond it. So that's the reason why I kind of talk about this. Having grown up in a narcissistic family, and I have family members still trapped in this narcissistic family, you can see that exactly this happens, let's say, with the monarchies of the world, the most famous of which is the British monarchy. They extend this, but you can see that, the Kennedys have a thing like this, the Clintons and many others, the Bushes, and so on. I'm also extending that there's this legacy to the divided way of thinking that connected to narcissism that is a normalized expression of abuse, and that we self-stigmatize ourselves under the guise of these things, so that we actually think that this is somehow normal. And the extreme version of this that's been occurring in our society lately is just it's just a louder version of that, because we've had a very loud person sort of give permission to a whole bunch of people, and so now we sort of have to deal with this. But the thing that I think we don't often understand is that this existed for a long time, but not only did it exist for a long time, but there's an underlying psychology that came with it during the setup of all these systems, and I like to shine a light on some of these things. The presentation that I'll give you a link to in a little bit you'll be able to go through all this. There's a ton of links and everything in here. So, but I did want you to see that this sort of abuse is not really, I know it's a really harsh term to use, but I think it's actually an appropriate one, because you can actually see that we have all these things going on, in terms of, that's the reason why we're creating all these systems and trying to do it in a way which is mindful of all of these things. And I don't think that it's reasonable for us to look at a system for trying to resolve conflict without understanding that we've got all this stuff sitting down in our psychological shadow, which has been so normalized that we might not even recognize it. And so by giving words and pointing out that these things actually do happen, not only in just a relationship that went bad between a man and a woman in a particular instance, this is actually something which is being done systematically across our entire Western modern computer using society. And so, yeah, here it is. Again, this is a technique for science denial, but it applies to many other things. And I'm not going to go into this too much, but this idea of idealizing, devalue, and discarding is something that we see quite a lot. And I think we all need to be kind of aware that this stuff exists and figure out processes to undo it. So for example, if I'm trying to build diversity, there's no real way to build diversity, but there are a lot of ways to build against it. And this, in many ways, is a chart of exactly how these things occur. So diversity is the nature of reality, complexity is the nature of reality, and these things right here, this idealize, devalue, and discard, is a process by which you can undo diversity and undo complexity and prevent that from happening. So it's important that we understand how these things work. So essentially what you end up with, once you've gone a long way, you start with an individual or a family, let's say the British monarchy, and the British monarchy goes out and conquers the world. And so now you have, them putting upon us their own sort of narcissistic, divided left brain way of doing things. And so now we have an entire worldview, which infects everything from medicine to science to everything, and essentially cultifies everything. You can see that even if you're doing marketing, the idea is to actually create a cult of people who really believe in what it is that you're doing and kind of trap you and isolate you from other ways of thinking. So those of you who were around in the 90s might have heard the PC versus Mac wars. This kind of thing happened. I actually worked at Apple, and it was very much like a cult, just working there. So, and then, like I said before, this pathology of privilege, and the privilege is a denial of the state of reality, the real thing. And if you combine that with the social contract that says that the privileged will never be made to feel the actual consequences of their attitudes or ignorance or their bias or their actions, like we're seeing a ton of in the news right now, then you can pretty clearly see that this psychological state, this privileged state, can only exist inside a systemic structure that is completely defined by abuse. And so it's really something else that I think you guys need to think about, just what a beautiful thing it is that we have a group of people, all of whom are really oriented on sort of penetrating the outer hard shell of that bubble, and the hierarchies and other divided stratagems that those people use to constantly fight for a higher privilege status. It's an incredibly challenging thing to be so open and to deal with the fact that so many people are going to bring in with them this sort of pathological division mentality that exists so pervasively in the culture. And so how do we get out of this? This is this basic pedagogy of freedom is something that's this chart right here, you can chalk up to Ken Wilber's work, which I've talked about a little bit before. He's a person who created basically a theory of everything called Integral, and it's basically consists of 5 parts. Waking up, growing up, cleaning up, opening up, and showing up. Right. And so what's interesting is you can see that all the people who are in this group today, and all the people who show up to all of the different meetings and get things done, there's quite a lot of development. In order for you to show up, you have to get through quite a lot of other stuff. And the people who show up the most are the ones who have most thoroughly gone through this process, and are sort of showing the way in their own ability to show up. But I think a lot of times we don't give as much credit or understand the underlying processes that a person who is showing up consistently and doing things had to go through in order to be like that. So I like to praise all the folks who are consistently showing up, because I personally, when I see people consistently showing up for things, I'm aware that there was this huge process that they themselves had to go through in order to kind of get there. I like this quote just because this is a thing that you see a lot more in decentralized organizations, and this is almost an assumption in a way, that is almost subversive to the centralized mindset of both organizations and money and other things that we've come to take for granted. So when you're waking up, there's a great link here. Tim Wise interrogates the lens through which we view our social reality. It's a very beautiful thing which I recommend you watch. And it actually talks about how to sort of regain autonomy and agency against this abusive culture. You must begin with self-acceptance and compassion, self-regulation, self-expression, and self-awareness. And for all of these things, I think nonviolent communication very beautifully gives you permission and understanding to work on each one of these things. I'd like you to also be able to see how my role in terms of sort of being a white guy and talking about these things, in society, is the whole idea is one of subversion, right? This comes from Neil Postman's work called Teaching, from the book Teaching is a Subversive Activity. It's very, very beautiful work that I would recommend everyone read. And what I've noticed in my spiritual teaching is that a lot of times what people's first spiritual awakening is that they wake up to this thing I've come to call the live society, right? Where you can see that society's been lying to you about a certain thing, and then you're like, okay, now I've got to go work on myself, and I've got to, become more unified in terms of my own, process, and I'm just going to keep saying it over and over, right? There are 2 different ways to think. So if you can suddenly become disillusioned with these divided strategies, then you can start to, get into more health. So then you have to choose your way out of the process too, right? So part of the thing about us creating these decentralized, sort of radically inclusive systems is that we have to choose our way against this, right? We have to choose our way against the divided strategies and prevent those divided strategies from gaming our system or otherwise, creating problems for us. And then we also need to assert our right to understanding in terms of our own individual selves. So I've sort of put my hand up and said that I want to make sure that I'm caring for every individual person in the whole of the Token Engineering Commons and all of the other places in which I participate. It's because I believe that we all need to assert our right to understand, and I want to support your individual right to understand. And I think that the processes that we're creating in the Token Engineering Commons are constructed with a view exactly toward that. And there's another great, one of my favorite videos called The Science Delusion by Rupert Sheldrake. It talks about that in terms of how we have to assert our right to understanding with respect to science. So the other thing that we had in terms of some pre-work here was to talk about, Jungian shadow work, right? And so mining the unconscious is really a good thing, and trying to understand what exists in there is an extremely beautiful process that not enough of us have learned how to do. And I think that because of this, that we bring that into the organizational context in which we operate. And so it's for this reason that you might hear me, recommending that we do something about that in terms of trying to get people to understand that in meetings and to talk about that. And some of the ways in which Libby and Juanca have made this happen in terms of trying to talk about ourselves during meetings can help to do that. So I'd like to do that a little more explicitly over time. So now we're getting into Cynefin a little bit, which is a sense-making framework that can help you overcome this confused sort of gaslit state, which can exist often just coming out of the media landscape and the general educational landscape, and sometimes families. This link here, Complexity, Cynefin, and Agile, is really nice, especially for those of you who are software developers. This goes back to the thing that I was talking about before, and this seems very messy, but the primary thing I want you to see out of this is that there's these words in red that determine the different kinds of action modes which exist here. So what's neat about this is a map that you can figure out what it is that you're actually doing. So for example, the Omega group within Token Engineering Commons kind of exists on the line between the chaos and the complex, right? And our idea with that group is to exist here and then to work our way back to create plans, right? So we actually kind of go across just the edge of the chaos into the complex and the complicated. So you might want to think about the different groups that you're participating in and figure out what action mode is appropriate for what it is that you're doing at this time in the Token Engineering Commons. And you can actually see from a left and right standpoint, the left side in this case is the unified, the right side is the divided, right? And it says even in here, when you believe all this simple, everything's ordered, and past success makes you invulnerable to future failure, think again, because before you know it, the chaotic domain grabs you by the throat and drags you into a crisis. And we're seeing crises all over the world now, in every area of human life, not just monetary systems. And then, we kind of go into the NVC side of the picture, which basically deals with personal, and it has larger societal and interpersonal and organizational implications. But we cover that a lot in other areas, so I'd like to skip over that a little bit. So this really goes into a lot of detail about different things, but I did want to just kind of pause for a moment because we're in the last 15 minutes and make sure that people had a chance to ask questions and I could take some feedback.
Thanks, thanks, Durgadas. And yeah, I see the full connection between this presentation and the whole of the Graviton training, because we should be able to understand that right now we are still within a lot of abusive systems, and with initiatives like Gravity, what we try to provide is that um, capacity to undo asymmetrical power systems. And
Yeah.
like if there is an organization, we know that there are going to be power asymmetries of different types, but we should try to treat equally all of the people that is participating in a conflict or in an issue, and like not objectivize any of the positions, and like fight against exclusion, and also to be mindful of the normalized expressions of abuse that sometimes we unconsciously reproduce. So I think that it's important to recognize the abuse of the system that we have, in order to be able to promote yeah, better systems through the unification of different polarities.
Well, and what I like about it is that it gives me a tool in which I can interrogate all other theories. So, for example, if I'm looking into something on the Cynefin side of this picture, let's just show you the newer version, right? There's a So this is the version 11 of the sort of Cynefin model that Rob England has made, right? So this is not as cute, but so if I'm doing a complex work, right, and then I'm coming up with constraints, well, the question is have I created a governing constraint here, or have I created an enabling constraint? Because if I've created a governing constraint, the thing that I'm moving into the complicated is something that bounds me. It binds me, right? And so, and that later I might then create something in the model, which then I bring up into the clear, and then later becomes repeatable. And now I've automated a thing that I didn't even consider whether or not I was creating a governing constraint or an enabling constraint. Because if I'm creating an enabling constraint, then that means that I can't really automate that, because that's going to be a complex system. And the very best that I can hope to do with that is to find it in an entangled state, right? And so the best you can do with an untangled state is to look at it from the complicated and the complex. You might be able to get it into the known and familiar over a long period of time, but it's doubtful that there might be parts of it that you can pull out and become clear, and then even fewer parts that can become repeatable. So it's just super important to understand what you can and cannot do with some of these things, and to understand that if you're experimenting over here in the complex and you can create a governing constraint, you might have then just colonized that whole system as it gets further up this energy model, right? And then if you continue to do that, then you might have forgotten something. Maybe you should have created something that was an enabling constraint instead of a governing constraint. And if you do that and continue to work sort of clockwise here, then eventually you're going to have missed something, and then you'll kick something off of the clear into the loss of control, and then you'll have to sort of account for the fact that you forgot that. And so that's my basic premise here is trying to make sure that people understand how, what kind of choices that you make when you're constraining things as you're experimenting, and then what exactly you're modeling when you're coming from the sort of expertise side of the picture and the complicated, has a big effect. And so I think when you're working in the token engineering commons, we're doing a lot of complex things. And so most of what we should be doing is doing things that have enabling constraints. Although, for safety reasons, because we're working with money, we might need governing constraints. But it's important to make sure you get that there is a difference between those two things, and get how, you might have to revisit that at some future point if the governing constraint that you placed on a process somewhere back in antiquity stops being reasonable for that particular application. So any other questions? we don't have very much longer, but I wanted to give the opportunity.
Yeah, more than a question is also to continue on the conversation, and that gravitons are people, should be people that is able to think in unified ways, even in difficult situations, because when we see conflict is an expression of diversity and of a divided way of understanding reality. And we as gravitons, when we approach a conflict, when the two people are having a divided point of view, our intention is to try to unify an understanding and to promote unified ways of solving the conflict. And yeah, it, I see so much information in your presentation, but it's really important because we are trying to stop reproducing the abuse, and that's why it's so important to first identify what is the abuse, and that
That's right.
what you were saying, that the post-truth, post-race, post-colonialism is a big lie, because we still see a lot of colonization
Yeah.
in the economy and within different types, and we as gravitons should be able to fight against that colonization and provide equality and to our systems.
And I think oftentimes, before we can achieve that, we need to be able to orient ourselves somewhere, right? To kind of know that there are, contextualizing frameworks like nonviolent communication, like, alternate dispute resolution, and but at the same time, there's also ways to construct trust, which is to say, to build things that subvert the possibility that a certain kind of divided outcome could come about, and if you think about it, broadly enough, you can say, it's important to be broad-minded, because it's important to be able to say, okay, I'm going to place a governing constraint on this and see what happens, and then to be able to go, geez, I see now that what I should have done was create an enabling constraint here, and that way I can, better leverage the actual complexity that exists versus something else. And so oftentimes we're doing this to ourselves in a way that we're not conscious of, and so it's my hope that through talking about all of this stuff and giving you some examples and giving you a bunch of data and links and other things that you can go and look at, that you'll be motivated to do that, so as to hopefully prevent, future suffering, future problems, and to be learn to be flexible enough that we can revise the systems that we make as appropriate.
So, Durgadas or Ivanka, may I ask
Yep.
like a question?
Yeah, we got 5 minutes left,
if-
but I can hang out a little bit longer if people are interested.
Yeah, I hope I make it short. If we recognize ourselves as still colonialized to a significant degree, even after going through this training, is it fair to either side of who we would be hypothetically mediating for to be considered a graviton? To what degree do we need to recognize ourselves as decolonized before we can kind of go forward?
Well, I would say in response to that every single thing that you're looking at is an opportunity to undo the apparent duality in front of you, right? And so in spiritual life, we say, well, we ask ourselves questions. We say, am I the body? Am I this sort of meat sack? Am I this food body? Am I this thing? And then through inquiry, you realize, what, I'm not. And then you start thinking deeper and you say, am I these individual thoughts? And then you do certain practices that enable to withdraw your mind from your senses, and you realize, geez, so much of my thinking was informed by the fact that I'm constantly in this relationship with the senses. And so you get a different kind of agency and autonomy over yourself in terms of that. So what I'm suggesting is that by being a graviton, you're going to be presented with a series of possible ways to resolve disputes. And I think that you need to be able to be high-minded enough not only to resolve a dispute on behalf of someone else, but I think you have to first find a way to resolve that dispute within yourself, so that you can then speak to it with a kind of compassion or authority or whatever that is impactful, because you have really examined the nature of all of these, because all of these dualities that you're going to approach, chaos or control or stability and change, or these different polarities, and there's a whole thing we can talk about later about polarity mapping, but all of those things are just opportunities to see a deeper and more complex version of what's going on. So, for example, you're saying right now, you've given yourself the very pretext of the question is, I've given myself a governing constraint. Well, I can't even maybe talk to a person if I'm already colonized. Well, but what if you just flip that around and say, well, maybe that's an enabling constraint then? This gives me the opportunity to look at the colonization that exists within myself and then overcome that. And then having overcome that, that discovery will then be fuel for you to better assist the people you're working with, right? Because as a graviton, one of the things you have to do is you have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of both sides of that picture. And that is automatically, by definition, pulling you up out of the duality in some way. And so I would hope that as a graviton, when you approach a given, dualistic conflict laden position, that you could see that sort of removal from the duality is crucial, right? Does that make sense?
Certainly. Yes, sir. Appreciate that very much.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Like I say, I'm aware that people might need to go after 2 minutes from now, but I'm willing to hang out for a little bit longer and continue answering questions. So I'll give it another 20 minutes.
I just wanted to remind people who is participating in this training that we also have a book club on Thursdays, and we are reading Nonviolent Communication book, and we are right now in chapter number 5, that is taking responsibility for our feelings. So it's not mandatory to go, but it's very complementary. And nonviolent communication, it's one of a framework to promote trust and to promote compassion within ourselves. So it's just to invite everyone to those calls as well, if you are interested. And thanks again, Durgadas. And I will open the mic for further questions.
Yeah, please do ask. Don't be shy. Don't bite.
I wanted to say thank you for the clear presentation today. I think for me, specifically, the very concrete answers within DAO, within the DAO environment, to actually run through this model and have it specifically seen in past situations, and then DAOs will probably help me to be able to execute on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, relevance is always a big thing for sure.
Yeah.
Well, if anyone has any questions, we can start wrapping up the call. And thanks everyone for joining. And yeah, if you have any question, you can stay a little bit longer for us to continue. But thanks everyone for joining this call.
And I'm currently sharing the presentation here. I think I opened it up to everybody with the link, so please let me know. Maybe can somebody just go there to the link in the Gravity channel and confirm that it doesn't require you to like request access or anything.
Yeah, it works.
Great, thank you.
Well,
I have to,
thanks
I have to
everyone.
jump, but I just wanted to say that I thought this was really extraordinary, and I want to thank you for sharing so much wisdom with us today.
Thank you, Tam.
Okay, see you
Thank you
later,
so much.
everyone. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, I'm still here for another 20 if you have questions.
Thank you very much. I also really enjoyed your presentation today. It was really well put together, and it
Thank you.
It gave me a couple of aha moments myself. My friend even joined today.
Oh, nice.
We really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I really appreciate any specific thing that jumped out at you or whatever you think.
Just honestly for myself, some of the cultural appropriation, the slide that you had that started from the oppression that went all the way up to the cultural appropriation. There was just some aha moments that I had for myself for things at time. I work in advocacy, and I'm a little bit older, and I deal with Generation Z quite often. Sometimes I feel there's a little bit lost from myself to that generation at times. On my side of the coin, not theirs.
Right.
And I think it's important to at times I feel like I'm a lot further when you had the, where it started up from waking up to growing up and, all the way to like guiding, I believe was the last one. And I do a lot of different programs in that kind of way. And I feel like I'm at the end, but then sometimes you have like some of these moments that bring you all the way back to step one.
Sure.
Waking up like another layer in the onion of your perspective of seeing something, from a different way, which is exactly why I'm consistently always trying to participate in things like this. Because you can never, really get to the middle of the onion, right? So it's always a beautiful thing when another perspective and somebody bringing it to you in a different way then can let you peel off another layer of the onion to see something in a different way, to be more open. So yeah, I really appreciate that.
Yeah, well, can I show you something that would speak to that?
Oh, I'd love it. Yes.
I'm kind of famous for, I have a graphic for that. So I literally have a graphic for that.
You know what? I have a feeling you've got a graphic for everything.
So I think what you're talking about here is that you can see then that you have this sort of self and consciousness, and this is the narrative framework that I use when you're dealing with people, right? So if I was talking about it from, let's say, child development, I would start with the it, right? So me having autism, right? So I'm going to develop in a certain kind of way. There's going to be certain strategies and things that are going to happen as I'm developing my self and consciousness, right? And so then as I then grow up out of my base self and become family oriented and then figure out my own power and, start to interact with how I want to organize myself and what I want to achieve and so on, depending on where I am in this group, which is what you were just talking about, right? You're saying that there's a never ending thing about this. Well, there is actually a pretty well-known developmental framework into which you basically go. And then as you, let's say you're the achiever self sort of person right now, which is most people, frankly, Then you come and interact with a pluralistic system like this one, which is trying to become integral. And I believe Token Engineering Commons is really right on the border between the green and the yellow here, right? You're going to be like, oh, okay, so there's some things in which I have to grow in order to see. Do you know what I mean? And then what you're going to then see is that the systems which are created by that culture and worldview then end up on this side of it. And then what is produced then out the other side of those systems is something else altogether, right? And so there's a kind of counterclockwise narrative that kind of I talk about. So when you say that as you go through these different things, that's true, but at the same time, there are some well-known stages in which these things occur.
Yeah, I do a 12-step trauma group, and then
Right.
my does CODA, and that's why I had him jump in as well. And so 12-step stuff.
Yeah.
And I've been doing it for like 10 years, and then I do a lot of advocacy as well. So yeah, we both really enjoyed everything.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Again, I'm still eager to hear other questions or comments. I know there's some people in here I know. Anything you didn't like about it? Something that rubbed you the wrong way, maybe?
I wanted more.
Well, I have, that's literally why I'm writing a book about it, because I got to 60 pages in my presentation. Some of those pages are very dense and contain a lot of information. So, it's really nice to have a unified framework in which you can understand the operation of society, because I think it's very despairing to have all these crazy things happen and then not have something into which you can have a narrative that makes sense and is congruent, and I found myself really wanting that, especially in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years. It's been very I don't know that I would have survived the landscape of the last few years without having some way in which to understand all of this, and so that's what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, I know a lot about narcissistic personality disorder, and I love what you had said about just mental health illiteracy in general. So,
and I think that people just don't understand the construction of these things, right? So the fact that we live in this asymmetric colonized system that is using coloniality to perpetuate these unequal systems that everyone is suffering from, right? And so that's why I don't like to kind of break it up into this sort of white guy, black guy thing, even though I'm a white guy and it might sound like I'm trying to avoid something around that. That's not it at all. I just didn't think it was diagnostically accurate. You know what I mean? I just felt like there needed to be some way to understand why all of us are here, right? Why all of us tolerate this system. Why is it that everyone, manages all this, right, in some way? And so, so this was my attempt to sort of unify things. And I don't know that I'll ever be done revising it, because I'm always going to have something to learn. But I really did try to consult with as many people as possible from the native band, and it was all taken as my whole process is one of subversion. If you look at real spirituality, that's a process of subverting your identity so that you can see the world the way that it really is. I think many of the problems that we have in our society are based in this kind of false identity that's perpetuated upon us by divided thinkers, right? And once you see it, that it's really hard to unsee it, and so. Yeah, it's nice. So when I read a thing, I can read that with the thinking of unified and divided. So if I read Charles Eisenstein, Sacred Economics, I can see that that's there, right? If I read, different leadership books, different, people trying to come up with different solutions for the different problems that plague society in different ways. All of that is a combination of unified and divided thinking. But unless you understand the context of it in this larger way and can identify the specific ways in which the divided thinkers, work and the unified thinkers work, then you might be creating a system that just perpetuates a different type of coloniality. And I think it's super important that we have tools to work against that. It takes an awful lot of education and individual sort of coaching and dealing with things. And that's why I'm here. I mean, it's the whole reason I participate in this community is to try to further that kind of thinking. And I don't find too many communities in which people are open to that, much less actively, wanting that to occur. And so this is basically one of those.
I appreciated, Durgadas, how you incorporated the sacred economics ideas, because I think the last time I saw one of your presentations using some of this stuff, I think that was really interesting to see Eisenstein's sacred economics presented in this DAO or token space, because it builds upon this idea of like, what are the different constraints that exist, and then also how do we look at money or monetary systems from a really human way, as opposed to this abstract thing that removes any kind of soul from it.
Yeah, decontextualization is the tool of the colonizer, right? That's and contextualization, and the pedagogy for contextualization is education, right? The pedagogy for decontextualization is ignorance. So, and you can actually see all of Eisenstein's recommendations are based in these fundamental motivations, right? What's wrong with the picture? What can we do about it? Just comes down to those two things. Right? So it's kind of, so when I read things, that's what I'm saying. It's a lens through which I can interrogate all these other things. And it gives me a kind of a way to, I'm just I need contextualization because my brain thinks about things so broadly now that I can't take any decontextualized fact as an individual piece, right? It just doesn't sit well with me. And I think we've been taught to do exactly that in our society. And I like to encourage, coach, present different ways to try to get, beyond that. And I love to read all these different books, about, potential solutions like Eisenstein and witnessing everyone here who's putting their money where their mouth is, literally, to do exactly that is a very beautiful thing.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't know about sacred economics, but I will read it. But also the other thing that I was thinking is that the good thing of going into the unified is that we can do checks and balances, and last week community call or 2 weeks ago we had this project called Sentry, and that made me think a lot because it's a project that try to give more value to a tree that is planted than a tree that is cut to be processed. So yeah, it's somehow a way that we can do checks and balances and promote economic activities that promote the unified a unified economy, and I think that's the main problem of our economy, that it only measures financial value in a framework of what is that a thing worth for in our economic system, but not it actually takes the whole meaning of the thing being part of our ecosystem or part of our nature.
Yeah, and it's actually it's sort of life and anti-life, right? What you're describing, you know. I like NVC because it's saying that it's a language of life, right? But I like to think that a well done economic system could be the economics of life, right? You could, I mean, spirituality is literally how do you think in more increasingly unified ways, right? And how do you contextualize, make sense of, and make relevant the divided stuff, because the divided stuff isn't to be thrown out either, right? It's not all evil. It's that when it's done in an imbalanced fashion, that creates a problem for you, right? And so to create a balance between the unified thinking and the divided thinking, we all still exist as apparently individual humans, but if you treat yourself as though you're not, just an individual, then you'll then extend that same thing to others, and that's a sort of basic psychological precept. Okay, so 3 more minutes, and let's say one more question. I'm gonna just ask Nate or Lauren, who are the people I know best left in this group.
No, I think you've done a great job, man. I really do appreciate you presenting today.
Thank you.
Me too. I'm sort of just hanging out, listening, because I feel like it was like just a lot of information, like a lot to take in there. And even with the slides, I'm excited for you to share the presentation because I feel like there's so much information on the slides. I want to like.
It is in there, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I included it, and thanks for to Tiffany for putting in the link to the Sacred Economics, which is online. I should have included that in my presentation, but the presentation is constantly in flux, so.
Yeah. Well,
great.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Durgadas, for facilitating this session, and we hope to see you, in further meetings.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. See you, everyone. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.